So earlier this year, when the world learned that Elie Wiesel had died, it sank in, finally, that the world would be without his moral voice forever, a voice which had provided an insistent reminder about the critical value of memory, about the importance of making space in the world for conscience and for human dignity. And when that happened, it was as if a light emanating from the spiritual identity of the Jewish people had suddenly gone out. And now this week, after the death of Shimon Peres, when we reflect on his death and its impact, it seems to me that a corresponding light has now faded out. This time, though, a light glowing from our political identity, from the part of our people from which Jewish autonomy, Jewish independence, and Jewish self-determination glow together. Now, when Elie Wiesel died, it was just before Tisha B'Av, that grim day on the calendar when our community recalls together the destruction that the Jewish world endured over the centuries. And Wiesel's death placed that time of remembrance into powerful new context. During his life, and now after his death, his work was to remind us and to remind the world that when we remember national, collective Jewish loss, we can't fail to acknowledge that they are at the same time deeply personal. Every year, Tisha B'Av is when we memorialize the enormity of the exiles and massacres in Europe and Africa, the Middle East. But this past year, that day took on a new meaning because of how Elie Wiesel had pressed us all to recall that even the days of vast destruction were all comprised of tiny individual losses, the vanishing of small individual lives, one after the other, and that the enormity of historic Jewish loss can't blind us to the singular tragedies experienced by individual Jews and their families. And now here we are again, remembering and grieving another enormous presence in the life and the history of our people. And this time, once again, just days before, a moment filled with religious meaning and a season of far-reaching religious perspective. And just as was the case with Elie Wiesel, to have lost Shimon Peres so soon before these Jewishly significant days of prayer and reflection, invites us in once more to consider how this one life intersects meaningfully with all of our lives and the life of the world. Now, on a national level, when we view Peres' role as a pioneer in the life of the state of Israel, the loss is, of course, massive because of the outsized role that he played in the history of the Jewish state. No one else did what he did for as long as he did. Over the years, this one man led the Ministry of Transportation, the Ministry of Finance. He served as Israel's Minister of Defense and its Minister of Foreign Affairs. He was Israel's Prime Minister twice, and he served as its president for 7 years. During a sprawling political career that spanned some 70 years, Shimon Peres was Israel's preeminent statesman, devoting his life to its care, its defense, and an ambitious vision for its future self. And so now that he's gone, the loss strikes us powerfully, not just because of the length of his work, but because he was the only one of Israel's original group of founding fathers who was still living. And so laying him to rest delivers to us a heavy responsibility, because with him ends the first chapter of Israel's founding, the book now closed on the first pioneers who knew that Israel could be anything, that it could be and really should be the shining light of enlightenment and morality, strength and compassion in a Middle East that had never before found stable footing between the grip of colonialism on one hand and the anarchy of tribalism on the other. When he was inaugurated in 2007 as Israel's president, Peres said this: "Israel must not only be an asset, but a value, a moral, cultural, and scientific call for the promotion of man, every man. It must be a good and warm home that creates equal opportunities for all." So over the years, I came to understand that my own Zionism and my own personal vision of what Israel can bring to the world was essentially a restatement of the hope that Peres carried with him, a vision that he refined and enunciated repeatedly over the decades. So what's the connection that this loss might have with the High Holy Days that are just around the corner, as I suggested earlier? Well, to understand it, if you didn't know already, you need to know that although Peres made his life as a statesman and a politician, his soul was the soul of a poet. I mean that on one hand literally, because he wrote books of marvelous poetry that you ought to get to know, though most of it remains untranslated. But what I also mean is that like a poet, he led at all times with his heart. He spoke unabashedly about things that most politicians don't dare to, about love and about hope and passion. He wasn't embarrassed to talk about his own spirituality and about huge questions about the meaning of life. One of his lines that I quote all the time is that he said, "The purpose of life is to find a cause that's larger than yourself and then to give your life to it." It's wonderful. So that's why his life, I think, brings new light to the holy days into which we are just about to enter together. His legacy will come to be known as having been focused on helping other people remember their potential and having encouraged them to stay firmly, proudly ambitious about pursuing it. Now, if you ever had the opportunity to hear him speak during his life, you might have heard the story that Peres told frequently about the moment when his family fled from Poland to make a new life in pre-state Palestine. His family lived in Vishnyev, and when he left with his parents and his brother in the 30s, he was brought to the train station by his grandfather. Now, hearing the story now, we imagine that his grandfather must have known, or at least suspected, that once he left that train platform, he would never see his grandsons again. And that turned out to be true. Everyone in the family who stayed in Vishnyev were murdered by the Nazis, many of them with their friends and neighbors by having been burned alive in the town synagogue. But when his grandfather left young Shimon on the platform, he offered him a piece of advice that always stayed with him, that Peres said would guide the rest of his career and the rest of his life. Be a Jew. Don't give up. What I love about the story is, first of all, the power of that moment on that train platform in 1934. That moment which, it is clear, became an instant of transformation and recalibration that shaped the way Peres would go on to spend the next 80-something years of his life. But secondly, listening to Peres as a poet, I love the poetry of those words. Be a Jew, don't give up. I love them because it seems at first that they contain two separate instructions, but it's really just one. Because to be a Jew means not to give up. To be a Jew means to be committed, to be ambitious, strong, inventive, and tireless, just like Peres showed us. No one more than him embodied the truth that being Jewish means grit and gentleness at the same time. And of course, there is no time like this one. Right before the turning of the year, when seizing that aspect of Jewish life is the most critical, when capturing grit and gentleness is the most rewarding. Now is the time to feed those twin flames in our souls, our Jewishness and our refusal to give up on ourselves. Remember what he said, the purpose of life, not of politics, not of work, but of life itself. The purpose of life is to find what's larger than yourself and to give your life to it. For Peres, that cause was the pursuit of sustainable regional security and enduring peace, of scientific and technological excellence that could bring people together, and a willingness to accept what might be imperfect now as a way of building toward a future that will become even better. That's what Shimon Peres believed we were put on earth to do. All of us have our own dreams about what our lives are meant to accomplish. But whatever we imagine about creating in this new year, now's the time for us to take our first brave steps toward it. So friends, as we move into the grandeur and the promise of a new year, I want to invite you to use that directive to shape your thinking and your prayer. I will be doing it, and I urge you to join me as well. That's the way that we will achieve our life's purpose in our families, in our work, and in our collective striving toward a world that is safe and moral and kind. To follow that precious advice, be a Jew, don't give up. May the source of peace bring peace to our world, and may God make peace for the eternal rest of Shimon Peres, Zichrono Livracha. May his memory always be for blessing. Amen.